You know, that bridge had memories for everybody in the county that grew up here. Whenever you made the statement anywhere in this county, the bridge, whoever you was talking to knew what the location that you were talking about. Of course, there's many, many bridges in the county, but the bridge was the Truss Bridge across Salt Fork River on 83 Highway.
It's just a phenomenal jewel. If you're traveling US 83 from Mexico to Canada, it's a great place to stop. One of my uncles, I was 4, 5, 6 years old, something like that. He chunks me in, and you know, of course, I'm thinking it's sink or swim, but I know they wasn't gonna let me sink. But I learned to swim, and I learned to swim pretty good. As a teenager, they had in high school and stuff. We would have bonfires and stuff like that out there. And sometime in the late '90s, I guess, when the park was just getting kind of established, we'd go out there and camp. And the whole time my kids were growing up, that's one of the things that they remember, and Dad remembers, is us camping out there at that river. I could cross that bridge at 5 o'clock, heading back to the office, and then I could go home and get the travel trailer and the kids and be out there flipping burgers at 5:30. Great childhood for me. Pretty good childhood for them too. So.
Prior to 1875, Buck Creek and Salt Fork River in Collingsworth County were popular Indian campsites. There's one man here that claims he knows where there was 43 Indian campsites in Collingsworth County. And I never have explored that much, but I know of several, but I don't know of that many. But there was one up the river from the Seal Crossing, about 1.5 miles on the north side of the river, that must have been a burial ground that several of the Indian bands used, because today there are 12 known burial sites in this area, and it's not a very big area. I mean, it's probably 5 or 6 acres at the most, maybe less than that. The man that Mr. Seal was the one that settled on this particular farm where this burial site is, and his great-grandkids still own that place today. There has been efforts by some people wanting to put up markers designating this burial ground. The grandson, when he was operating the place, started to get this done, and he went to the Comanche Nation's headquarters in Lawton, Oklahoma, to talk to them about it. And they didn't want to do it, to mark it and make it public, for fear of people destroying it. And there had been an attempt to do that back earlier, years ago, like in maybe the late 50s, early 60s. There was one of the graves that was dug up and the contents removed. And at that time, the third generation was running the farm. And he and one of the neighbors made it one of their priorities to find out who done that. Well, the neighbor did find out, and between the landowner and his neighbor, that guy brought everything back. He got out of that grave and buried it in the same spot. And then another time, right across the river, Mr. Pritchard, his primary activity was he had a gravel pit right east of his house on the south side of the river, and he sold gravel. Probably a third of Wellington's got his gravel in it, in the cement, because they hauled gravel all the way to Shamrock out of it. It was a big gravel pit. In fact, he ended up moving his house one time, get it off the gravel so he could sell the gravel. In the I don't remember the years when this was. It's in the 30s or 40s though. And digging gravel out of there, they found 3 skeletons. And these 3 skeletons had all the hands and all the feet chopped off of them. Nobody could tell whether they were Anglos or Indians or what. But the theory that I've always been told was that they were traders traveling across the country that traded with the Indians, which there was a lot of that went on. And they just massacred them and stole everything they had. But all up and down, like I said, Salt Fork and Buck Creek, it's real common. I know the one that is really a big one on the old Cedar Ranch over south of McLean on the north side of the river. And I haven't been down there in 25 years, but the last time I was there, you could still see the black spots in the ground where they had their fires. It was just as black could be where they, so evidently this was a pretty well permanent camping ground. And it covers, I don't know, 30, 40 acres. It wasn't no little deal. And it's probably about at least 300 yards from a river, which amazes me. It's up on the top level. You know, most rivers have the water and then another bank and then a third bank. And that's the way this one is there, but it's quite a ways from the water, which surprised me. And we have found arrowheads down there. The burial grounds on the Seal farm for years and years, and I assume this was probably in the maybe teens and 20s, had to be almost, I think. The Indians would come from Oklahoma to have a 2 or 3 day ceremony at this burial site. They would just kind of move in on Mr. Seal. He was still alive at this time. And use his barn for their horses and all of his feed to feed all their horses while they were there. Never asked him, and of course his wife was scared to death they was going to scalp everybody. Whenever they would leave, well, they would leave him a big pile of blankets. And he always thought that was their way of paying him for the horse feed that they used while he was there. And this went on for several years after he settled on that farm. And this may have been in the 1890s. It could have been. His grandson and great-grandson have both told me over the years about it. And like I say, they're neither one here anymore, but the great-grandkids still own the land. And they were said to be, I mean, Mr. Seal always told his descendants that they were Comanches. On the crossings of Salt Fork, there was 6 from the west side of the county to the east side of the county. There was one on the Cedar Ranch over there south of McLean, one at Dozier Creek, south of Dozier, and then this crossing where this bridge was called the Seal Crossing, named after one of the early settlers that came here in the 1880s, late 80s. And then there was a crossing where the Baptist encampment is now, which was called the Rocking Chair Crossing, which is the trail from the headquarters of the old Rocking Chair Ranch to Wellington. And then there was one at OM on down the river toward Oklahoma. And the first bridge was built in 1891 on Buck Creek, or then some people called it Spiller Creek, which is still on some of the maps as Spiller Creek. Southwest of Wellington, they cost $150. And then there was 3 or 4 more bridges built from 1903 to 1908 on different creeks. But the first bridge built on Salt Fork was at Sealed Crossing in 1910. And it was a pony truss bridge, and was located about 200 yards west of where the Parker Truss Bridge was on 83 Highway. And there is a cement abutment of the 1910 bridge still on the north side of the river and the south side of the river. Of course, the one on the south side of the river is growed up in trees and you can't see it. It's kind of like a jungle over there now, but the one on the north side has been kept clean where you can see where the north end of that bridge was.
There was a bridge built there in 1934. Sometime in 38, I believe, there was a big flood come through, and it took out the middle portion of that bridge. A bridge at Quail got washed away. It come down, hit the railroad bridge west of this steel bridge. It took it out. Then they come down and took out that bridge, and then they kept going down river and took out the one that goes over into Oklahoma on the same river. So it was just kind of a cascading effect.
Before Greenbelt Lake was built, that river carried lots of water when it rained. Our watershed goes all the way to north of Claude. It goes back up north of Claude, nearly to Amarillo. So if it rained up that way, lots of times the river would come down when it didn't rain here.
In the late 30s, 38, 39, right along in there, they got a contract and they erected that bridge, the center section. And so at that point it was just two bridges. There was a two end spans from 1934, and then the new spans that were at that time put up 38, 39.
The bridge that was declared the historical place was started construction in April of 1939 and completed in November of 1939. Then it was destroyed in 2012. So there's been three, well really four, bridges built at Seal Crossing. Like I said, the Truss Bridge in 34 was a Parker Truss, just like the one that was built in 39. And that at that time in the 20s or the early part of the 20th century, the Parker through Truss Bridge was the preferred type of construction for all highway bridges in Texas. You know, there's not very many of them left, but at one time there was a lot of them across the state of Texas.
One of the concerns back then was the roads. I remember my dad had a Frisno and a double blade that he worked the roads with some. Now, I was very small back then. I was born in 29, and all this highway, I guess, began in the early 30s. But Dad he worked the roads to pay his taxes, and he bought that equipment and pulled him a horses, of course. But it was all in front of our house, and down around there was pretty sandy, very sandy in front of our house for a mile. And there was a little bit of traffic, but not much.
The beginning of the highway building in Collingsworth County started in 1932 when the contract was let to build Highway 4 from the Childress County line to Salt Fork River. And I really don't think construction on that started until 1933 or maybe even 1934. The first truss bridge with a hard surface road was not completed until 1934. The best I can determine is that they built Highway 4 in maybe 15-mile sections or something like that, because it was later on when the Highway 4 was completed onto the Wheeler County line. That was the second project in the county. And they didn't even go all the way to Shamrock. They stopped 2 miles south of Shamrock, the county line. And I don't know when it was completed on across Wheeler County.
As I was doing this research in this history, there it became evident that there was this old highway called Highway 4. I'm not sure when they named it US 83, but in the 30s it was Highway 4. And it actually started up here on the northwest corner of town. Where we're on 83 right now, it was Haskell Street back then. That was where the highway was. And you would turn, and it's a county road now, but you kind of zigzag through there, and as it got close to the river, it started getting close, and this old highway was coming up with this new highway, and they got really close together, quarter mile south of the river.
When they started building the highway, apparently they started in about 33, I guess, 1933. Of course, I was born 29, so I wasn't very old, but I have a vague memory of what I remember. I knew they were going to build a bridge across the river. I didn't realize what a job that would be that is a big undertaking back in the 30s. In the first year, they paved from the Childress County line to 8th Street in Wellington. Then the next year, you didn't do much work in the wintertime, concrete, see. And the next year, they paved from 8th Street to Ludi, which is north of the river. Well, they had to build that bridge in there. Then the next year, they paved the road on to the Wheeler County line. Well, for a few years, it was gravel road on from the county line to Shamrock. Shamrock had brick streets like we have, and then they finally let a contract for that, but that gave a good road through here.
Before Granddad died, he had bought a Model T truck, and when they started the road construction on Highway 83, Dad took the job of hauling dirt, and he was forced by the rules to hire a second driver because they wanted the employment up. So Dad went out and found him a man who was willing to accept the pay and sleep. He didn't want him driving. Dad did all the driving, but he had this hand that rode with him and slept. Dad actually never talked a lot about the road construction, but he did a lot of talking about that Salt Fork Bridge. Like I say, it was something, it was a real event here in this county. And I'm trying to recall some of the stories that I heard. One of them was that those columns, pilings, whatever you call them, are big, huge hollow cylinders. And the crews that dug those excavation for the columns actually worked inside of there. They could suffer the bends if they came up too quickly from digging those pilings.
Suspension spans were on piers that they had to use cofferdams to get those down under pressure, and water-bearing material, which was, I guess, quite a problem too. And for some of them, I think there's one or two died out there with the bends.
Prior to the building of the bridge and the moving of 83, where you come up out of the Salt Fork, you came straight south to Wellington on what became Haskell Street. And it was before I was born when Highway 83 was actually put in. It brings you in on the east side of town. Lots of stories about making it up that hill when it was still a dirt road. A lot of times on the Model Ts particularly, which didn't have fuel pumps, the drivers would have to turn around and back up the hill so the gas would gravity feed to power the Model Ts.
Back to the bridge up there, we never got to go that far from town. That was goodness, that was 5 miles out to the river. We didn't go out there just to see that bridge being built. Now I understand that the bridge was built, well, I always thought it was built in sections, but I've heard that the complete bridge was built and assembled together and then disassembled and shipped in on a rail car. Well, the train track didn't go out there. And somewhere, I assume that the highway department had the truck. But it may have been the contractor that had this old, it was an Army surplus World War I truck, and I think a Republic. It didn't have a top, and it had a steering wheel that went right straight down between the driver's legs, and then had a long bed on it. And they hauled, I guess they hauled all of that bridge out there on that old truck. And they said they had 2 speeds, low and high. And high gear wasn't very fast. Low gear sure wasn't. But they, if they were making a trip back to town and the time run out, they'd park it in our yard. I don't know how many trips they made with that old truck. But they hauled that entire bridge out there apparently. And then, we heard a terrible noise coming, clackety clack clack. And here was an old crane, old time crane come down the highway going out there to help set that thing up. But as it went up, it got more interesting, and we ventured out there a time or two just to see it. And then it got away from us. They got it built, and I don't remember the dedication of it or whatever they did to say it's open now.
Well, that part of the county, people go more to Shamrock than they do to Wellington, primarily because of the salt fork. It's a lot easier to cross Elm Fork to the Red River than it is the Salt Fork. So a lot of people went to Shamrock a lot. For some reason, well, a number of reasons, my dad chose to come to Wellington, or my family always did, instead of Shamrock, for most of our entertainment and socializing.
I lived through the story through my mother because I was 2 when the accident happened. I don't remember that much about Daddy. I call him Daddy Odell is what I always called him because I had a stepfather I called Daddy Leroy because he helped raise me. But I lived the story through Mother most of the time. She would always have times where she would need to talk about it, and she'd talk to Charles and I, my brother, about the accident and what she went through. And she remembers that Daddy had come home for dinner. In fact, Daddy used to keep the truck at the house most of the time, even after he got off of work at night, because that was part of it. He just, back then, everybody kept their work trucks at home, because if he got a call, he left from the house and went to deliver the tank, whether it's Saturday or Sunday, whatever somebody needed fuel. So Daddy had brought the truck home that had lunch. And there's always a speculation, why didn't he take a longer lunch? But he didn't. And he left the house a little after 12, and I think the paper said the accident happened at 12:30. Mother always made the point that the car went to pass the grain truck, and when he got out in Daddy's lane of traffic, Daddy hit his brakes. Daddy said when he hit his brakes, he just couldn't hold it. I mean, you always had a pull to the truck anyway. Old brakes, most of you know, it wasn't disc brakes back then. It was the old type of brakes. And once he hit his brakes, from what I understand, the truck kind of pulled to the right. Then he tried to correct that. He got out of the truck after the fire, and they were trying to put it out. And he was wanting to jump off the bridge, and they wouldn't let him. This is Mother's perspective of it. He was on the Shamrock, the north end of the bridge, and the
bridge was such under fire that they couldn't bring him to Wellington. So there's a man had a brand new car, and he was there at the time of the accident, and he put Daddy in his car, and he drove him to Shamrock, to the hospital. He got Daddy to the Shamrock Hospital. They went and got Mother. They couldn't cross the bridge, so they went towards Quail. And from what I take it from reading the paper is the fact that they had to cross an old county maintained bridge out by Quail, and they got to Shamrock. Mother and Daddy stayed up for nearly the 24 hours he lived, and talked, and I'm not going to tell you a lot of what they talked about, but they talked and they had their time together. Said neither one of them slept that night. Then Daddy died, I think the paper said around 1 o'clock the next day. Had to be awful traumatic for her, especially sitting with him for that as long as she did, as bad as he was hurt. And of course, I always told her that was a blessing. That was a blessing for her, because she got to live 24 hours with him, just him and her, and they went through everything that they needed to go through, able to go through try to make some, because he knew he was dying, make some, what do you call it, closure for her, and but you know, she lived it quite often, and she did up until the day she died. And like I say, she lived that over, how correct she got on some of the things that happened. Daddy speculated and always second-guessed himself and everything he'd done. He knew he was dying, because he kept telling Mother, said, "Mother's no way I'm going to live through this because I'm hurt too bad." Charles, my older brother, he remembered Daddy a little more than I do. You didn't keep the body at the funeral home. The funeral home went to the house. So they brought Daddy to the house. I don't remember this, but Mother said that I would just stay at the casket all the time, that he was given a military funeral. And you can edit this out, but I'm going to tell it anyway. I think it needs to be out there, is the fact that I can't hardly attend military funerals. Mother said that when they shot the guns off, I went straight to the casket and just, she don't know what happened. Said they couldn't hold me. I went straight to the casket. But anyway, this was recorded by the Wellington Leader in 1949, and this is the account of the accident. An investigating highway patrolman, Blackie Calloway, and Herman Moore, who was with the Sheriff Claude McKinney, investigated the wreck. Has reconstructed the accident from evidence available. The car in which the Lawson men and Evans were riding pulled out of its traffic lane, starting to pass the gasoline truck on the bridge. Mr. Floyd seen the car, applied the brakes to the gasoline truck in an effort to stop. The truck went out of control, sideswiped the grain truck, then crashed into the car, basically head on. The gasoline truck burst into flames, ignited the creosote pilings on which the bridge rests, and burnt off the tips, allowing the bridge to drop about 2 foot. Still, horizontal supports and railings were wrapped by the heat of the fire. Mr. Floyd was able to get out of the truck, but because the bridge could not be crossed due to the fire, he was taken to Shamrock Hospital by passerby. Mr. Evans and one of the Lawson brothers were brought to St. Joe's Hospital by Dotson James, and a third member of the party by Kelso Funeral Home Ambulance. That was the account of the paper of the accident. There's more in there.
An accident out there, a fuel truck ran off the road out there, and it caught fire, which caught the north end of that bridge on fire, because they were made out of, the columns were made out of wood piling, drove in the ground, and all the wood up above it burnt, which meant the bridge fell in. The steel beams, everything, the heat just was just too much, and it took it out. So they did a contract sometime back there. That part I'm not very familiar with, but they actually had to add a couple of spans on the north end of that thing. So the bridge that we seen in after 19 probably 50, late 50s sometime, was actually 3 different bridges.
About 6 years ago, I got a phone call from a girl named Vicki Lawson Justus, Justus. She lives in Elk City, Oklahoma, and she is the daughter of the eldest Lawson brother that was killed. We've maintained contact. She became friends with Facebook. In fact, I told her that I was doing this interview and wanted some information about her dad, so that I could relay that also to those that's viewing this video, to know that their family was probably impacted just as much or more than mine was. Her dad was Bonham Lawson. He was born May 27, 1920. She, at the time, was just had not been born. Her mother was pregnant with her. She died. She was born in December of the 1949, after her dad had passed away. And her uncle was Billy Lawson, born May 24th, 1929. He wasn't married, but he was engaged. And the family claims that Billy was doing the driving at the time of the accident. Lawson's brothers also had an older brother, Jess Lawson, and Mammy, who they'd been working with. It says the newspaper quoted that one of the Lawson's brothers died at the hospital, but she claims both death certificates from the coroner or whatever said both died instantly at the wreck. So I don't know. The paper said one thing and the death certificate said something else. But she did have one brother that was older than hers. Probably he's a little older than I was. He's maybe 6 months older than I was, but he's since passed away. But anyway, I just wanted to get her information into this video because her dad was a veteran of World War II. He'd served throughout the war and had 2 Purple Hearts that he had received during the war, and that, like you say, their family was impacted just as much as I was. I tried to find out information on the third member of the people in the car, the third member that was killed in the car, Mr. Evans, and I have yet to find any information on him. I don't know if the museum's got any information, but I was going to try to find some information on him because that accident not only affected this community, my family, but 2 other families besides mine were impacted greatly because of this accident on the bridge.
And there's another recording, and I can't remember exactly when this happened, but there was a son and a father traveling down 83 Highway, and they stopped to spend a night at the bridge. Evidently they had some bedrolls with them. Well, when the son come up the next morning, the father was dead. The only records that we have of this is a recording in the Wellington Leader, and somebody, I guess the local sheriff and district attorney, determined it was murder. And they were sure that the son had killed his dad. But after investigation, he was acquitted. They didn't have a trial, but they didn't have enough evidence to charge him with it. But that murder has never been solved. The theory was that somebody was after him going down the road and found him, but how he got killed with the son not knowing it's a mystery. Of course, we have a lot of unsolved mysteries in this county. I mean, you got more than you can count on all your fingers.
Well, that is our most famous incident, I suppose, with the bridge, is the Bonnie and Clyde incident. Bonnie and Clyde were fairly young, especially Bonnie was young. They also traveled with with a very young man, W.D. Jones, which was actually just a kid, 17 or 18 years old. And that makes me sad to think that a young man that age was turned to crime so early in his life. But at any rate, Bonnie and Clyde buzzed into Wellington in a 1933 Ford that they'd stole from, I believe, a druggist in Oklahoma somewhere. They actually were in town for at least one night, maybe more. I'm not sure. There was a tourist court out on what we know as Haskell Street. But at that time, the highway came down 8th Street and then turned north on Haskell Street and went to Shamrock that way. And when I see that road, I've not traveled that road much after you get to 203, but that is just filled with sand. I don't know how they sped down that road very fast. But at any rate, they were here in town and they ate lunch over at the Wellington Hotel, which was located where Wellington State Bank is today. And while they were having lunch there, they had already got stuck out south of town, out on South Haskell Street, way out of town. And when they called Kelly Pig Ford dealership to come send a serviceman to get them out of the sand. And when he went out there, he was able to just drive the car out of the sand. He didn't have to pull it out. And so they come back to town, and at any rate, they have lunch at the hotel coffee shop or restaurant, and all the men who worked for Kelly Pig had to take turns driving by the hotel to see the car that they were in, because it was the first Ford that they had ever seen that was any color other than black, and it was maroon. So that was a real thrill to them. They'd never had any at the dealership that was of any color other than black. But also, they were seen north of Sam Norwood, also out in the side roads, and they had a flat, and they didn't have a jack. So a young man stopped to help them, and he changed the tire for them. And Buck Barra gave him a $20 bill for helping them, and it was the first $20 bill he had ever seen. So, $20 in those days was a lot of money for a young man to pick up in a few minutes.
And another deal while they were here, the guy that run the Ludy store, Jess Deeger, got word somewhere or another that Bonnie and Clyde was going to rob his store. Anyway, he got a deputy to come out there and spend the night with him when he understood that Bonnie and Clyde was supposed to rob him. And they were outside of the store, and there was a car coming over the hill from the south, driving real slow. For some reason, the deputy struck a match to light a cigarette, and when he struck that match, the story is that car speeded up and went by the store wide open. And Jess has always thought that that deputy lighting that cigarette saved him from being robbed that night, because they were pretty sure it was Bonnie and Clyde.
They come right by our house. Matter of fact, they stopped and talked to my sister through the door. And of course, she didn't know who it was. He was driving a brand new 33 Ford coupe. Next day we found out that they'd run off the bridge out there, and the story goes on,
But they stayed in this little motel that was out on what we know now as Haskell Street. And then, I don't know, I know that the Cartwrights said it was about 10:30 at night when they've had a family gathering at their house. It's just that was located just south of Salt Fork River, and they'd made homemade ice cream, and a couple of the guys were out on the front porch eating, and they realized that this car was speeding down the road, and one of them said they'll never make that detour. The bridge was out. They had put a wooden bridge across Salt Fork in 1910, but it was out, and they had the highway finished up to the place for the bridge, but they didn't have the bridge. You had to cross, you had to go off this new highway that stopped abruptly and change over to the old one and go on into Shamrock. And he missed his cut, and he just went right off into the river. Well, the men rushed down there to see him. When they get down there, Buck is crawling out, and W.D. Jones, who was with them, was crawling out. The windshield's all broken out. And they crawl out through the windshield, and the young men helped them out. And then they discover that they thought it was a kid that was in there with them. And they said, well, there's somebody else in there. We've got to get them out. And so they did have to kind of pull Bonnie out. She was hurt more than the guys. I don't think the guys were hurt at all. But Bonnie suffered, by this time the car's on fire, and she suffered severe burns, probably from battery acid or the flames, and she never really walked again after that. Some stumbling walk, but most of the time, especially if they were in a hurry, they carried her. So they carried Bonnie back up to the Pritchard house, and the Cartwrights were there, and the Pritchards, the Cartwrights were children of the Pritchards, and the women applied some salve, just store-bought salve, to her leg, and that's all the treatment she got. They said she needs some help. She needs a doctor, and they said, no, we're hot. You can't call a doctor. We're hot. And they didn't know who they were. Of course, they probably didn't have access to newspapers or anything. Even though by then Bonnie and Clyde were pretty well known, the law enforcement people did not realize who they were working with. And they did, one of the Cartwrights pushed a car away from the house so that he could be away before he started it, and then came into Wellington, and he wanted to get medical help for Bonnie. And he did ask for ambulance, and incidentally, the only ambulance they had at that time was the Hearst from Ellis Funeral Home. And they did start out there. However, they never got there. They got stuck in the sand out there. But the law enforcement people, they alerted them when they got here in town, and they just walked up to that house casually, and of course Bonnie was inside. Most of the time she was lying on the bed or something, but she got up and got some guns when the sheriff drove up, and the men went out the back door and come around. So when the sheriff went in the house in the front door, then they're surrounded by W.D. Jones and Buck Barra. And Bonnie, by that time, even though Bonnie is severely hurt, she's got a gun. And they take them and take their car. And they take them with them. And they start down to Shamrock. And they were supposed to meet Buck Barra over by Sayre somewhere. And I think perhaps that might have been the river bridge on Elm Creek that they were to meet them at, but I'm not positive. But at any rate, they were to meet them on a country road around Sayre. And so that's why they just killed time in Wellington till their date to meet Buck and his wife came. And so they're now on their way over there. And all the time they're going, they're chiding the policeman for having a Ford because it was not fast enough. For having a Chevrolet, because it was not nearly as fast as that Ford they had dumped in the river. And of course, Bonnie and Clyde had a habit of getting the car dealerships because they had money, but also they had cars. They also robbed armories because they had the latest weapons. And so at any rate, they went on over there and they met Buck and Blanche, and they decided on the way over there that they would not kill the two men from Wellington because they had actually, when they started from down here, they put Bonnie in the front seat between the two men and the law enforcement in the back. But before long, she was in so much pain, they put her in the back seat and she laid across their laps, the men's laps. And because they had helped her in her pain, they decided they wouldn't kill them. So they took their handcuffs and some barbed wire they found on a fence nearby and tied them to a fence over around Sayre, and then left them there. And it didn't take them very long, probably a half hour to get loose. And they found their car just up the road because they'd left with Buck and Blanche. So they had the car to come back to Wellington in. The car that went into the water was rescued by the insurance company. It was stolen, but it was refurbished here in Wellington and sold to the Goforth family. And for many years, you could see it driving up and down the Wellington streets and known as the Bonnie and Clyde car. But I have it on pretty good authority that it's probably been crushed and no longer available anywhere. They did not get medical assistance for Bonnie until they reached Arkansas about a week later. So by then, her leg is really in serious condition, and she never really walked normally again after that, and much of the time they carried her. It was probably around a year later that they were ambushed in Louisiana, and it's a sad ending for a couple, especially Bonnie was so young, and W.D. Jones was very young. He was even younger than Bonnie. But it was just a thrilling life, I suppose, for them. We have had people from many places come to the museum just to see the Bonnie and Clyde. We had a man come from Norway at one point. He had a list of every place that Bonnie and Clyde had been, and he was checking them off one by one. And recently, when we moved the highway bridge and built the new bridge out there, he emailed me and wanted to know for sure that the Bonnie and Clyde historical marker, had been moved to the park. And I emailed him back and told him, yes, it was moved to the park. It was relocated. So he keeps up with it even today. Some of the artifacts that were found, and these were found by young men, just teenagers from here in Wellington, who were diving in the water out there after the accident. I suppose they were looking for things. And we have a glove that's Bonnie's, and even though my hand looks as big as it is, it's not. My hand is much larger than the glove. It's a very small glove. It is a leather glove, and of course it was in the water. We do treat it occasionally with something to keep the leather soft and preserve it as long as we can, but it is a leather glove that belonged to Bonnie Parker. And The clip is one of two that the museum owned that young men, both of them, found diving well or wading in the river following the accident. Of course, I'm sure that after the flurry and people realized who had been in Wellington, that they probably did more people out there looking. Also, another interesting fact is that Henry Wells tells me that his dad said there were two regrets that he had as his years of newspaper editing here in Wellington, and one of them was that he was out of town when Bonnie and Clyde went off in the river, and he didn't get to write the story first-hand knowledge. So I might add that W.D. Jones, was a young man. W.D. Jones lived to be 70, somewhere in the 70s, but he died of violent death. Somebody else that was, he turned to drugs, and he was hooked on drugs by then, and he was shot, I think, on a street in Houston. The influence of Bonnie and Clyde, I'm sure, ruined his life.
The early memories of everybody that grew up in Collingsworth County was the big reason for not wanting to destroy that bridge. Because we all went to picnics, high school class parties, swimming parties, and there was, all the time I was growing up, in my late 40s and 50s, there was a real good swimming hole on the south side of the river down there that was clean water and sandy banks, and it was just a perfect country boys redneck swimming hole. We had many, many good experiences down there. There's a few people that's still around here that will admit that they used to park under that bridge on Saturday night. Just like I said earlier, when you said the bridge, anybody that lived in Collingsworth County knew where you was talking about.
Of course, we all played in the river, and we walked up to the railroad bridge and back, and up about 12 foot, I guess, 13 foot up there. There's a beam across every so often, across the highway. And one time, there's about 5 of us sitting on that beam, just sitting up there on it. And there was another brace rod that went up, took it to hold to if we slipped a little bit. As far as I know, nobody ever fell off of that thing. But we were sitting up there, and Mrs. Admar, she had a 35 Chevrolet car, and she was coming to Wellington. I thought it'd be exciting for her, so before she got there, I hooked my knees over that rail and just swung down upside down in front of her. Well, she stopped right in the middle of the road, and I understood pretty well that she didn't appreciate it. And she forewarned me what she'd do if I ever done it again. So I didn't ever do that again to anybody. But that's ignorant, but that's kid stuff for you.
Well, most of the time we were just under the bridge. Of course, because you could go past the bridge. Just as you got on the north end of the bridge, you made that turnaround, and you go up on the bridge. We did go down there swimming, and we did a lot of playing under that bridge. In fact, I can remember going on the north end of the bridge and noticing the difference between each end of the bridge, and I knew the reason for the difference between the concrete pilings on the bridge and the timber pilings on the south end of the bridge. And people say, well, they didn't understand. I said, I do, because in 1949, when my dad was killed there, he burnt those timbers out from under the pilings on the bridge, and it even warped the steel, so they had to replace all that in order to let traffic on. I can say in 1968, the year I got married in June, my bachelor party was there. And my stepdad come down and helped had the bachelor party, and he left us all sleeping at the bachelor party, but it was at the bridge too.
Of course, now the traffic picked up over the years. There was several trucks that had a route through here, freight trucks and such as that had a route through here. And one is a truck called Looper, which was it wasn't refrigerated, but it had ice in it, and they hauled meat, I guess, stuff that's perishable. And one day they came by, this was a semi truck, a 20-foot bed, I guess. And an old boy standing with the door open on the side of that truck, and when he passed our house, he threw out something. And it sat there smoking. Scared me to death. And I went in the house. Daddy was gone working somewhere down the field, and I went in the house and told Mother, I said, something, I don't know what it is, smoking out there. You come see. She said, oh, that's what kind of ice? Dry ice, yeah. Said, we'll make ice cream, just a little old chunk. Well, we made 2 freezers of ice cream and had ice left, I'll tell you. But that scared me to death when that thing started smoking. I thought, we're fixing to blow up.
And another deal that was down there at one time, and I don't know how long this lasted, but I don't think it's very many years. But a man built a wooden dance floor on the north side of the river and the west side of the bridge, had Saturday night dances on the river. And like I said, this didn't go on for very many years, but it was real popular while it was there.
Well, my grandfather was running for county judge, and I don't remember exactly what year. I wasn't in school yet, so and it would have been between the time I was 3 and 5 probably. And anyhow, Daddy Temp had me taking tap lessons because he thought that all girls had to take all of these things to make them more attractive and everything. And since I was the first grandchild, I was the one that had to do all of this. So he had me taking piano lessons, tapping lessons, voice lessons, the whole works. And so one day I was with him, and he said, I've got to go out and do some campaigning. Pick your dog up and let's go out there. My dog's name was Popeye, and he enters into this too. And so we get out there, and it's on the west side of the road out there. And I'm standing there, and Daddy Temp said, I'm paying you to do this. And he said, get out there and tap and get the people on here so that they'll know that I'm running for judge. And then he'd pass out the envelopes or the papers or whatever he had at that particular time. And the dog would get out there and run around me in circles because he didn't know what was going on. And we started to leave, and the dog was sitting there on the platform, or the dance floor, or whatever you want to call it. And I had my first orange soda pop with the dog. And so anyhow, we left, and the dog stayed because Daddy Temp forgot the dog. And we got back to town, and he said, oh, I've lost your dog, Popeye. And I said, let's go back and get it. So we went back, and the dog was still sitting on the dance floor waiting for us to come back. And Daddy Temp said, there's some more people here. Get out there and dance some more for them. So I got out and tapped some more.
And then there was Uncle Jim White had a store on the north side of the bridge, west side of the highway. And Uncle Jim was a legend in his own time. He and his brother came to Collingsworth County in the mid-1880s with a herd of horses and settled in the Aberdeen area. He had this store there. He had one gas pump, I remember, and the store area was probably 14 foot square, and he had a few shelves and sold a few groceries. And back west of the store, on the north side of where Pioneer Park is now, he had 3 little buildings that he called tourist courts, and people traveling up and down 83 Highway, and this was the beginning of the motels and hotels. But people could stop and rent those little buildings and spend the night. And they weren't very big either. I would say they weren't over 20 foot square, and there's just room for beds and a light, and I think that was about it. But they were the beginning of the motels.
So I started digging through all the old newspapers. First things I noticed was the hopelessness that the people had. They had no jobs, the economy was busted, and they were all so thankful just to have something to do. I've heard several old-timers talk that there were several hundred people at different intervals involved in that project, and as well as the road projects too, because there was no work, and they were just so happy to have something. The other thing that I noticed that really jumped out at me was you could see in these paper articles when they were getting this money for these sections of highway that they were building, and I'm not sure what happened south of Childers. I think the Wellington leader was mostly covering what was happening as the highway was approaching Wellington and as it was going on up into Wheeler County. So that is just my reference that I have right there. But the most important thing I noticed out of that was we were leaving the horse and buggies. All of the infrastructure at that time was in large part made for horses and buggies. Now we're going into cars and trucks, and there wasn't a lot of cars and trucks, but there were some. But you could see we're going from a dirt road to a paved road where these vehicles won't get stuck in the mud. Let's say the two things I walked away with that was the desperation and actually thankfulness that the people had a job or could find something to do to make some money. And then the other thing was we were leaving the horse and buggy days. It was over. You know, and sure enough, within a few years, probably by the 40s, you didn't see many horses and buggies going down the highway anymore. I mean, it was all vehicles and all trucks.
World War II broke out, and we had a change of things. Speed limit came down to 35 miles an hour, and a lot of the traffic out there was military vehicles. Just one bunch of them was hauling supplies to the Childress Air Force Base. They had a training station out down there, and I thought it was peculiar, but I found out nobody could ride on those vehicles except authorized personnel, and they wanted some Bermuda grass to sprig the air base over Childress, and my daddy had a little Bermuda grass pasture he's plowing up, and so he gave them the sprags if they'd haul them off. Well, WPA was in business back then. That was the Workers' Progress Association, which there was 13 men walked out that 2-3 miles, and we'd plow it up, and they'd shake them roots out. And every afternoon, a 6x6 truck would come in there, and they would load all those sprigs on the truck. And those guys would all start walking to town. This truck would go out and pass them, and he couldn't pick them up. And I just thought, well, that's pretty selfish, but that was from higher authority.
At this time also, I went to our district office over at Childress and I pulled a set of the original plans on this bridge structure. And the tremendous amount of work that went into making these bridges. At a time, in this day and age, and I've built many bridges, overseen a lot of them, and we have cranes, track hoes, backhoes, pump trucks for pumping concrete. The work now, it's just as hard, but we have a lot more equipment to do it with. In those days, they would have a couple of hundred guys working on that bridge. If I'm not mistaken, they had a steam crane that they used to raise and lower a lot of those bridge members, but it ran off of steam, which is something we don't use anymore. And then I believe the concrete was mixed right there on site, but a lot of the work as far as the finishing, forming, and all that, it was 100% labor, all by hand. Very labor intensive. Today, they are for 10 to 12 guys, but we've got track hoes that'll pick up 30 tons, and we've got a crane that'll sit there and pick up 100 if you need it. So there's just such a different age and time. You see this country opening up. You see that there's a possibility where a guy, he lives on a little farm, and the big event of his life is to go 5 or 6 miles into Wellington on Saturday. If he got to go to Amarillo, that would be like a lifetime achievement. You know, there was a lot of mobility in those days, but there was a lot that wasn't. You know, you if you think about it these days and times now, if we need something at Amarillo, I can be there in 90 minutes, no problem. Do what I need to do, and I can be back in 90 minutes, no problem. Hitching up the wagon and mules, that's a little bit different of a deal.
There was a lot of people that wanted to keep it, but they knew it wasn't practical, and TxDOT bent over backwards for years to preserve that bridge. And they even built a 4-lane highway from 2 miles north of Wellington to Ludi that extended the life of that bridge a little over 30 years, because it was so narrow, and with the trusses on it, it prevented oversized loads on height-wise from crossing. And they had to do something, and especially on oversized loads, to get the traffic down the highway. So that's when they built the 4-lane highway from north of town here to Ludi. And they, like I say, they preserved the life of that bridge about 30 years.
Back in 1970, 3 or 4, whenever we built the new bridge on the west side, I did the hydraulic design for the length and height and all that for that bridge. And me and Glenn McLean drew the plans for the 4-lane divided part, the rehab from town to Ludi. And at that time, the district engineer did not want to mess with that bridge. So there was a good place out here at this first curve to diverge those lanes and go on through that bridge. And then when you got to Ludi, there was that other curve, and you could converge them back to a 2-lane road. It's perfect. But the whole purpose of that was to not disturb that bridge.
About 50 years is about the life of a bridge. You can get more time out of it doing more maintenance, different things, but eventually, I always like to say gravity wins. The Truss members, they were still relatively as good as they were in the 30s. But the deck and the beams underneath it, that's where all your water, salt from the winters where they treat the bridge decks, because they, as most people know, they ice up first, so that's what gets treated first. There's just a lot of elements beginning to work on that.
Later on, they come up with an idea of cathodic protection. Anyway, it's a new concept on bridges where the old bridge, they put salt on them all those years in the wintertime for ice. And what that does, it induces an electric charge. And once that thing is induced, it'll travel, it'll jump into that steel, and it'll go to where it finds a release, or an opposite, it'll jump out. And where it jumps out, that's where your corrosion starts. And it'll rust that steel and cause the concrete to spall, as they call it, which falls off. So, in order to stop that, they come up with this cathodic protection design where you lay a hot mix cover. It's made out of coke breeze, which is what an old battery's made out of, you know, a flashlight battery, that black stuff in there. Only it's got asphalt in it. So you first embed some copper anodes in there. Then you lay the groundwork and the wires and whatnot, cover this up, and induce a small voltage which covers that whole thing. It's conductive, this coke breeze is. Well, any rogue charge that emits, it will pick it up and take it to this copper anode, which is a sacrificial anode. And it will sacrifice that anode rather than the steel. And we did that in about 86, I believe. And I was project engineer on that. And it lasted 26, 7 years. But it was a big problem. All those years they put salt on there. They were eventually wearing it out and didn't know it really at the time.
And then as the 90s started rolling around, or toward the end of the 90s, it was really showing its age. I mean, they were having to do a lot of patches on it. There'd be just holes fall in it, small holes, but at any rate, they were holes. By the late 90s too, there was also starting to get to be some significant holes in the beams underneath it, in what you would call the web. A steel beam is made up of a top and a bottom flange, and then it's made up of a web. And the strength of that beam is in the web. So when the web starts getting holes in it, then you're having some structural issues. And then over on the edges, a lot of those bridge members came together, and they had these big things called flange plates. That's where all the rivets were driven to connect all the pieces of that. And a lot of those were giving it up. And some of the rivets, same way. They were really starting to get in bad shape. Age was really taking effect. When that bridge was built in 1938, probably the heaviest truck out there weighed 30,000 pounds. By the late 90s, they could get permits to push 100. Of course, they quit permitting them that high to cross that bridge, but your average truck was 80,000 pounds. That's 40 tons. which was over twice what that bridge was carrying when it was first built. You know, so traffic these days. And the other thing about that was in 1938, 39, there would be a few trucks a day go across it. And by the late 90s, 83 was carrying about 2,000 vehicles a day, and probably 1,000 of them were trucks. You know, so you have a significant amount of usage on that structure. So sometime around 2010, a large hole fell in it. So at that point, we had to stop. We had to do something. The structure itself was no longer viable for heavy loads, wide loads, or height loads. We built some detours to get traffic off of the bridge. We closed it, completely closed it. Nothing was allowed across it. We barricaded the ends of it, and then we had all of our traffic shifted to 2 lanes over on the southbound bridge.
The way we got involved in the bridge project was 2009, the district engineer with TxDOT called Fred Squires, who was chairman of the County Historical Committee then, wanted to meet with the committee. And they had been working on this for I don't really know how many years, but for several years, to do something with that bridge out there. In 1994, it had been designated as effectively insufficient, I believe is what they called it, which meant that it wasn't supposed to be used for traffic. There had been a lot of discussion, pro and con, and then in 2000, year 2000, that bridge was designated and listed on the National Historical Register as a historical place. When the district engineer met with the County Historical Committee, he asked us if we thought that bridge ought to be restored or destroyed. And at the same time, he gave us the dollar numbers of what it was going to cost to destroy the old bridge and build a new one in the same location, or to restore the old bridge and reroute the highway. We had the motion made, and the second, to destroy the bridge and build a new one in the same location. Because if that bridge had been rerouted, the numbers he gave us, and there was like nearly $4 million difference in destroying the old one and building a new one, or restoring the new one, old one, and rerouting the highway. And it was pretty evident that there was going to have to be a condemnation case in this if the road was rerouted. Anyway, it was going to cost the county a lot of money. And that was the thinking of a majority of us on the historical committee. It wasn't a unanimous vote, but it was a majority. Took them a couple of years to get the agreement with everybody to destroy the bridge. And it was destroyed in 2012.
TxDOT was very instrumental in making sure there was some some bronze plaques that were on the bridge. We had one of them that we give to the museum, and then down in the park we built this kiosk, and we had that bronze plate mounted on a pedestal there, and then also we used some of the steel bridge members to erect the kiosk. That's what holds that kiosk up. And inside that kiosk is a lot of information about that era in time when all of this was going on.
The beginning of Pioneer Park started with the Collingsworth County Commissioner's Court in the early 1970s. My father-in-law was one of the commissioners at the time, and they were RVing and running around the country in an RV, and his dream was to have a RV park and a rest stop at Seal Crossing on the Salt Fork River. Sam Norwood Lion Club is either in 72 or 73 built the first playground equipment in this park on the west side of the bridge and the north side of the river. And over the years there, the Commissioner's Court got the participation of Parks and Wildlife to put some money in and build a rest stop, restrooms and water fountains, plus an open pavilion with tables and a barbecue pit on one end. That is probably a third of the area of the park, and the other 2/3 belongs to the county. And they maintain an RV park with an on-site attendant to take care of the park. And we do some RVing ourselves, my wife and I. We run into people all over the country that brag on Pioneer Park. There's very few RV parks that have running water within 100 yards of where your trailer's parked, plus all of the trees and the natural environment. And there's people that come from 200 miles off just goofing off and come down here because the atmosphere is so good, especially in the spring and fall. It can get pretty hot down there in the summertime. There is, I think it's 30-something hookups, and there's another pavilion on the county area of the park that is open for family picnics and family reunions, and it's used by, I know, a lot of school classes from Shamrock and Wheeler and Hollis and Childress come to that park on their end of year school activities, because there's plenty of room for the kids to run and play, and good shades, and these open pavilions do have electricity where you can plug in your whatever you're using to cook with. You don't have to use open fire. I've always said ever since that park was completed, and we have traveled a little, it's the best roadside park from Mexico to Canada. Another part of the agreement to destroy the bridge was to have some kind of a get-together or barbecue or something to record, anyway, that the majority of the people did support the destroying the bridge. So between the museum people and the board and the county historical committee, come up with the idea to have a barbecue and a blowout out on the bridge, and we called it Farewell to the Bridge. And we didn't know it at the time that we was doing this, but this is one thing that TxDOT had already put in the memorandum of agreement with us here as part of their efforts to record and preserve the history of the bridge. So we come together on the idea and didn't know each other was even thinking about it. And it was a pretty big deal. There was a lot of people out there, and we got all the people that wanted to get on the bridge and get their picture taken, and it's a real good picture, and I think it's probably the last picture ever taken of that bridge before it was destroyed in 2012.
But TxDOT put a lot of effort specifically into this project, and I will say for me, it was an honor to be a hometown guy and get to be a part of it. 45 years ago, when I was a little kid playing underneath that bridge, I'd never seen the day that I'd be building one right there in that same spot. Never seen that day. So it's just an honor, to get to be a part of that.
I hated to see the bridge go. But working for the highway department, I knew why it had to go. It was, if anybody had seen the work on the bridge, you know, you wouldn't want to drive. You wouldn't want to drive across it the last 5 or 6 years that it was in use, because it was getting all the salt and the decay that happened to the bridge. Really made it next to impossible to refurbish.
And I wanted to save the bridge too, but when I'm very practical, and when I realized how much money it was costing to maintain it, it just seemed not a wise decision for the highway department to try to maintain that bridge.
When they dropped the final span, I wasn't there, and it was a sad day when it went down, but economics and practicality overruled history.
I think probably getting to participate in this project was a lot more meaningful because I'm from here. And when I was a little boy, my uncles throwed me in the water out there and taught me how to swim. So right there underneath that steel bridge. So, you know, it has a little bit of historical significance for me.
It's like the human body, you know, you can only do so many maintenance operations on it until the core, you know, the heart and soul of it someday is going to be deficient. As sad as it is to think about something that beautiful to have to be torn down, but it's the truth of the matter.